Welcome back to another video, guys. So on this video we're going to be dealing with something called microservices architecture. We're going to be explaining what a microservice architecture is and how it works, and then some of the benefits that we get to have when we implement this kind of architecture. This architecture, it is basically based on deploying your application to yourself. But before we go to the modern way of deploying, on which is microservice architecture, we're going to be looking back to those days on which people used to upload their applications. So this is how applications were deployed on a server or on a cloud. So what will happen is that we will build an application, our front-end application, on which takes data from our backend. Consider this to be more of like an API, right? And then we'll just deploy this thing as a single unit to the application, to the server. But things have changed now. Since we have introduced that there was an introduction of something called microservices architecture, the main thing now is to do what? Is to break our application into small components and applications on which they run independent from one another. We build and deploy them as what? As a single unit. It's good for what? For maintaining, for enhancing your application, and also it is fast. So this is how we implement our microservice architecture to this current application that we have here. We take this front application, we make it into its own service. We take this also into its own service. Then we delete this whole thing. Then we do have what? We do have two different services here. We have a front-end app service, we do have our back-end service. So now we have to do what? We have to deploy the services independent from one another into what? Into our cloud. Now the question becomes, how do we do that? We introduce something called a Docker. A Docker is good in terms of what? Deploying our applications automatically into the server. So let's delete this thing. So now we have these two different applications as two different units, right? And then now we want to do what? We want to deploy them to a Docker. But for those who are new to Docker, they might be questioning what a Docker really is. A Docker consider it to be more of like a ship, on which a ship contains what? Different containers. Now, since this is a ship and then it contains different containers, where are those containers? This is where we come back to these services that we have created. When we are about to deploy our service to a Docker, we consider it to be more of like a container, if it makes sense. So what we'll do is we'll just push this thing into a Docker as a container. Now it becomes what? It becomes a container. Let me just add a text here so that you get to understand what this thing. It becomes what? A container. So now we do have a front-end container. But the question is, how would Docker understand how to run this thing? For example, let's say this thing is a .NET web application, right? How will Docker understand how to run this thing? Remember something, to run this application, we have to do what? We have to say .NET web application, right? And then to do that, what we'll do is that, so as I said, this thing now becomes what? A container. Now, since this is a container, this container should have what? Some instructions. Like we should instruct a Docker on how to run this thing. In .NET, we might have some simple command to run an application. It can be in a form of like this. We can say our instruction could be what? .NET run, and then specify what? Our project, and which can be something like this, and then specify our name. So this could be a command of running what? Our application, and then we need to notify our Docker on how to run our application, right? So how do we do that? We introduce something called a Docker file. A Docker file is where we instruct our Docker on how to run our application or our microservice application. So we're gonna create our file on which it contains what? Some instructions on how to run this thing, and then we attach it to our service or to our container. So now this Docker knows how to run this thing. If we were to run this application or to deploy this thing and then make our Docker run it, it will look into this file and then do exactly as we instructed it to do, right? So we now what now we want to do, we want to deploy another service into our Docker, and then we do write our own way of running this thing. We instruct Docker we instruct Docker on how to run this application, right? So now it becomes a problem when we have 10 other services, meaning this thing will be stacked with a lot. Okay, meaning this thing will be stacked with a lot of I want to mark this thing. Okay, so now this thing will be stacked with a lot of this kind of things. Can I just stretch this thing out? Can I just stretch this? Yeah. So just imagine we have something like this. It'll just be a lot of work. So as you can see, Docker knows how to run this thing as a single unit, right? And also knows how to run this thing as a single unit. Yeah. Same applies to all of those containers. So now we question, how will we make, because remember something, an application overall contains this together, right? So how do we make sure that Docker knows that these things are not just separate applications, but they actually work together to build our full application, if that makes sense? So we introduce something called Docker Compose. So Docker Compose is also a file on which is more of instructions on how we want our applications to run. Remember something, we said Docker, we want to create a container called front-end app and the back-end app. So let's go back So now, since we have two containers within this application, within our Docker file, we need to instruct Docker on how to run both of them. This Docker file contains instruction on how to run a single service. So now we create a Docker Compose file on which it's about instructions on how to run both containers, if it makes sense. I hope it does. So you're gonna be having something like this, and then we can have let me look for a better okay, let me just use this one. Let me delete this thing, and then this thing is going to be stored in here. What have I done? I want to copy this whole thing, put it in here. I can just send to the back, and then let's expand this thing. Let's make it on the send and also include this thing. So yeah, so now we created our Docker Compose, and then now this will be more of a single application, but they are how do I put this thing? These are actually separate services, right? Let me delete this. These are actually separate services. We do have a container, we do have another container, and then this thing is more of how Docker should run all of those things into a single application. It'll be more of a single application when they run, meaning this thing could probably include instructions of how to okay, it'll be more of instructions on how to run our application as one, meaning it'll be instructions hey, run this application on this specific port, and also run this application on this specific port, and then access maybe database from this. It's more of how to use this containers as one, basically. And then from there, this whole thing, we now push it to okay, let me expand this thing. We now push this thing as one into our Docker container, or Docker into our Docker, was it a ship or something like that? Yeah, So now Docker knows how to run this whole thing, this application as a whole. Meaning, the first thing it does is that it looks into this thing. It'll be like, okay, so I do have what? I do have this containers called front end and back end. So this thing is okay. The first application that needs to be ran is this one, and it's going to run on a specific port. And then now after this thing has successfully run, we go to this one and then run it on a specific port. So the question is, how do we run it? Then Docker goes to this one, knows how to run this thing, and then also comes to this one, knows how to run this thing. So now this thing becomes one single application when it runs. But when we're deploying it as what? As two different containers. I hope it makes sense. So that's basically about it. I feel like that's enough about microservices architecture. Like in overall, I would say we separate our applications into small services, and then we create our Docker file, and then we deploy them into our Docker. And then as we add services, we're gonna need a Docker compose in order to make sure that this the containers are being ran appropriately, so that we don't just start running this thing before we run this thing. If our application goes like this, if our application is pointing this way, we should instruct our Docker to run it this way here, if that makes sense. So that's it actually about microservices. I hope you understood it. Thank you for watching. See you in the next upcoming videos. Cheers.